it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator, the chair, for our last session here. John Nagel is the John N. Matthews Professor of Law in the law school here at Notre Dame. His work, he's done outstanding work and very well-received work in the areas, especially in the area of environmental law. His most recent book, which just came out, I think, from Yale University Press this spring, is Law's Environment, How the Law Shapes the Places We Live. John has also been a terrific Riley Center fellow. He's a person who, in the words, the term Kathy used and the way she used it the first day, a true bridge builder here at Notre Dame between the College of Law, the College of Science, and the College of Arts and Letters. So a perfect person to be chairing the final session of this interdisciplinary conference. John, thank you so much. What people have been doing actually is sitting right over here. Okay. And you can sit here if you like these. This would either way.
I will do what everyone else.
Okay,
so
great.
I'm not going to break new ground here.
Okay.
So let me move my stuff over there. So where have you just been? Excellent. Okay. Fantastic. All right. Well, let me first say how pleased I am to be able to be here this morning, and it's just a delight, and I'm really excited about the presentations that we're going to have and to be able to hear them, and so I don't want to say much before we get to that. I will add that as happy as I am to be here today, I wish I had been here the last couple days, but in fact, I have a number of students who hope to graduate on Saturday, and that's contingent upon my grading their exams. So I've been kind of busy doing that, and you'll be pleased to know that all goes well for them so far. As you know, I teach environmental law and write about environmental law, and I also do some other things as well. I work on property law, I work on kind of the legislative regulatory process. And in the course of doing that, I've encountered nanotechnology issues from time to time, but really can't kind of claim any particular expertise. But I have read some of the kind of legal scholarship that has addressed this over the last few years. And one article in particular that struck me was written by Gregory Mandel, who's a professor at Temple University School of Law in Philadelphia. And he wrote in a piece on nanotechnology governance a couple of years ago that the uncertainty surrounding nanotechnology's potential benefits and risks creates significant challenges for the regulatory system. Regulatory systems are designed for then existing technologies and often face difficulty when applied to emergent changes. Nanotechnology is not regulated as a particular technology yet. Rather, nanotechnology is currently regulated by a number of agencies depending on the particular products and uses involved. And even though I can't claim expertise in nanotechnology, I certainly am familiar with the kind of scenario that he's talked about. You know, on one hand, I'm familiar about that because I regularly teach a climate change law seminar where we're trying to apply existing laws to a quite challenging problem that in many respects is similar to nanotechnology in terms of the kinds of implications it could have. This also reminded me of the book that I just published, in which, since I like the cover, I more than writing the book, I'm happy that I took the cover photo, so I'll put that there for you there. But in the book, I try to look at how the law actually affects different places. As environmental lawyers, we think that we pass this law and then it's going to apply wonderfully throughout the country just as it's supposed to. But I suspected that wasn't quite true, and in writing this book and by focusing upon particular places and the kind of whole collection of laws that affected them, I certainly confirmed that. And indeed, in one chapter noted that there were probably 24 different federal statutes and state laws and local ordinances and even international agreements that can affect a particular place. Well, with nanotechnology, I think we're at a similar kind of position. There is no definitive single nanotechnology law, but nanotechnology presents all sorts of interesting issues that you've been talking about for the last couple of days, And they then raise, in turn, regulatory and legal issues. And that's what we're going to talk about this morning. So our three speakers this morning come to this, thankfully, with much, much more expertise than I do. And let me just kind of introduce them all at the beginning, and then they can proceed in turn. First, we'll hear from Susan Brienza, who is an attorney, as you can see, with Patton Boggs, one of the leading global law firms, again, as you can see, where they are located throughout the world. She's in their Denver office. Before becoming an attorney, before graduating from Stanford's law school, she received a PhD and taught English, which I find to be a especially kind of interesting and helpful way of thinking about these things. Her practice is really in kind of compliance with the kinds of regulations that, say, the Food and Drug Administration or the FTC have, and with a particular interest in these kinds of issues that we're going to be talking about today. So she's going to talk with us first. Then we're honored to have with us Carlos Pena, who is, and I'll have to read the entire government title here since I used to have one of these myself, the Senior Science Policy Advisor in the Office of the Chief Scientist of the Office of the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. You know, try to put all that on a business card. What that really means is that he is kind of performs the lead role in the FDA's work on regulating nanotechnology. He serves on the FDA Nanotechnology Task Force, and we're delighted that he's here to talk with us as well. And then last but certainly not least, we have our own Greg Crawford, who is the Dean of the College of Science and a Professor of Physics here. Before that, he was Dean of Engineering and Professor of Physics at Brown University, an illustrious career which includes inventor or co-inventor of 18 patents, publishing 300 research and education papers, and editing several books. I can say that if his experience was like mine, all that happened before he became a dean. Certainly I did nothing of the sort when I served briefly as an associate dean. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to Susan to begin us today, and I then have the only task I have is to kind of wield these cards to make sure that people are on time. I'm sure you will be. So, Susan.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and again, it's a pleasure to have been here for all 3 days, and it truly has been interdisciplinary and dialogue and debate, and I'm sure everything that Kathy and the organizers intended. Kathy mentioned the word bookend for this last cluster, and our wonderful moderator mentioned his own book with a beautiful cover. So I wanted to take this opportunity to present a relatively new book. It's now, I'm sad to say, about a year old, to the university's library. It's called Nanotechnology and FDA-Regulated Products, The Essential Guide. Not my title, but this was the idea of the editor-in-chief of FDLI, the Food and Drug Law Institute. Ralph Hall, Professor Ralph Hall, has 2 chapters in the book on medical devices and drugs, so if you want to learn more about that. There's a different chapter on cosmetics. I have a chapter about nanotech in foods and supplements, which is something that's not covered in this conference. And then there are also chapters on environmental law and on worker safety, occupational safety, written by Don Ewart, who was mentioned as one of the definers of risk by our speaker formerly with NIST. So it covers a broad range, and also finally covers, I shouldn't say finally, but because, you know, the philosophers always feel like they're last, like the philosophy of science or policy thinkers. But it also contains a nice chapter written by Eric Fisher, who was mentioned by David on the first day as one of the collaborators within the ASU Nanotechnology and Society Center. So I thought your library or your center would like a copy of that. You're welcome. Okay. Well, I've changed my title a little bit. I feel as if this is mislabeling, also called by the FDA misbranding. And the FTC might call it false advertising. I will try and cover all of the topics suggested by my original title, but I felt as if we needed a little bit on the benefits and risks of nanoparticles used in cosmetics before we talked about consumer awareness and labeling. What I would like to cover today, if the time cards permit, is a very short history of cosmetics and how important they've been for American women throughout the ages, actually not starting with American. FDA's current regulatory schema, and this has come up a couple of different times during this conference, but today is the FDA Day, and the fact that cosmetics do not require pre-market approval, and that makes all the difference in the world about how they're viewed. Some of the benefits and risks of nanoparticles in cosmetics. The FDA's task force report on nanotechnology, which was issued in July of 2007, and to my knowledge, there has been no formal document since then, but I'm going to argue that there probably should be, but we'll wait and hear from our official FDA speaker about the reality of the future. And then a very important topic that is when are cosmetics treated as drugs, whether they contain nanoparticles or not. And a large part of my presentation is going to be contrasting cosmetics and drugs. Very important difference because, again, it leads to the difference between pre-market approval and not. And the idea that whether a cosmetic uses nanoparticles or not, or uses nanoparticles and doesn't mention it on its label or any of its labeling or advertising, if it's making certain types of claims, that alone will put it into what I call drug land, and might cause the FDA to deem it to be an unapproved new drug until it is approved. Then we're going to look at consumer awareness and understanding, which is not very great at this point in the history of this technology. And maybe this group can ultimately do something about that. The FDA's position on labeling and what might be done about that to improve the situation for consumers. And are there any solutions for this regulatory dilemma? The dilemma being that many cosmetics, perhaps as many as 1,000, according to John Bailey, who is the former director of the Office of Cosmetics and Color Additives, now with a private consulting group. But his estimate is as many as 1,000 currently, as of a year ago, actually, cosmetics and sunscreens with nanoparticles in them. And yet, many of them do have drug properties, and yet they are regulated as cosmetics and not as drugs. That's the dilemma. You've all seen probably versions of this, different applications of nanoparticles, and cosmetics is just one of the smaller circles, smaller words here, obviously not as much in the forefront as foods and as nanomedicine, which we heard about yesterday. Probably most in the news has been those smart, targeted cancer drugs made from nanoparticles that hopefully go right to the cancer. But cosmetics is very important in terms of the huge size of the market, which developed in popularity at least since ancient Egypt. And it's very interesting to me that about 4 years ago, the FDA was considering expanding an existing OTC drug monograph. Over-the-counter drugs are governed by a monograph system, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And so the FDA actually issued a call for comments to the public, to stakeholders, about aloe vera, that wonderful gel-like substance that comes from the aloe vera plant that many very good cooks and and prolific bakers have right on their kitchen counter, so that if you get a burn, you split open a leaf and you squeeze out some gel and put it on you. And aloe vera was actually used by Native Americans, and there's great literature on that. Even before then, there is talk about, in the literature, about the milk baths that were enjoyed by Cleopatra. And of course, about 8 years ago, lactic acid and various fruit acids became very popular in cosmetics. So we keep going back to the ancients. There was certainly early aromatherapy in the 1500s and in England, and many of you remember Ophelia's famous madness speech, where she mentions different herbs and says, I will use rue for my grief, and I will use thyme to overcome time, and that sort of thing. But even in Shakespeare's day, or especially so, there were herbal booklets that identified which herbs you might smell or rub on your body in order to achieve certain states. And we do this even now with lavender. We have lavender pillows. We have lavender face masks for when we go to sleep. So again, the ancient becomes the modern, or the older. Victorian women use buttermilk and rice powder for the complexion. And what I've pictured here is an old-fashioned label. I wish it were bigger. It should take up the whole page, really. So through the ages, women have used makeup in part for appearance, self-esteem, to look younger, but also as part of the word makeup takes us to drama, to part of a costume, so that there's day makeup, evening makeup. You would identify whether you were, what class of woman you were, whether you were in, shall we say, the world's oldest profession or not, with your makeup. And lipsticks especially, but makeup of all sort, was very, very popular. And of course now we have Mary Kay and other such companies, but Avon was one of the first ones, and goes back, I believe, to the 20s. In those days we had 10-cent lipsticks. Now if you can find lipstick for $10, you're doing well. At the higher end, of course, you have the exclusive salons, the department stores. Now we have spas that carry certain spa lines. Of course, there was a little bit of sexism in various ads. I just pulled one from 1933 about whether or not a woman was innocent. Apparently her makeup was too blatant, but even in 1933, ads were talking about achieving the natural look. But during this time, even as of 1933, and you know, we've, as you probably can imagine, we've had makeup probably as early as mankind in terms of part of ceremonial costumes and dance. But in the US, it's interesting to note that the first Food and Drug Act was called precisely that, the Food and Drug Act of 1906. And those are the two items that the FDA was most concerned about for foods in terms of safety, because of the meatpacking plants as exposed by the novel The Jungle. There's law and literature combining here. Many of you know that. That was actually one of the origins of the first Food and Drug Act, was that book, The Jungle, showing that something had to be done about meat safety. But the other impetus for you lawyers out there was that the U.S. began to be worried about not the safety and efficacy of drugs, but the intellectual property of drugs, and how we're going to safeguard that, and hence the Food and Drug Act. But it was not until 1938 that we had the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So there was a huge amendment. And then in the 58, there was another huge amendment in the 70s, in the 80s. but in 1938 was the major one. And the impetus for that was that, of course, there were cosmetics already on the market, but the ingredients were not monitored at all. And lye, if you can believe it, lye was used in face creams, and horrendous chemicals were used for mascara. And several women, including very wealthy women, became blind. And then the government paid attention. So there was this major amendment, but the government decided that, unlike for drugs, no pre-market approval would be required for cosmetics. Why? Because it did not make, quote unquote, therapeutic claims. It didn't claim to prevent or cure or mitigate any disease. So, as you will see later, the definition for cosmetic is for beauty, for appearance, to stay on the surface only. And then the question is raised, well, what happens when it goes beneath the surface? And how far beneath the surface does it have to go? Through all 9 layers of skin, into the bloodstream? At what point does transdermal mode of action, does that alone make something a drug rather than a cosmetic? Safety, by the way, safety testing was required. Let's see if I can go backwards. Under the 1938 Act, but it was and still is a matter of the honor system. And the level of safety testing for a cosmetic, unlike for drugs, is not spelled out. It's simply the company must do some safety testing before they put the product on the market of the individual ingredients and of the formula as a whole. And if you don't do such safety testing, then you must have a warning on the front label saying that you haven't done any safety testing. So when's the last time you've seen that? Probably never. I personally have never seen any kind of warning. In terms of the labeling, this is just very brief, and then we'll go into it in more detail. The ingredients do need to be listed on a cosmetic. Usually it's on the back of a container. I brought a container with me, but it's sitting in my satchel there, but you can practically just memorize it. It always starts with water for a cream base. So it's simply a list of ingredients in descending order by weight without the amount required to be specified. So forget particle size. The cosmetic label doesn't even have to declare the amount. In terms of the current market, it's obviously a multi-billion-dollar international industry. There's no doubt about it. Well over $7 billion for skin products alone. There is an ingredient that became popular about 8 years ago called AHA, alpha hydroxy acid, which is, some people call it like a poor woman's face peel. So there are many products that substitute for actual dermatological treatments that are 100 times more expensive. So AHA creams became very popular, and during the Depression, it was very interesting that cosmetics was one industry that did not falter. You can see an almost identical thing happening in this current recession. Let's hope we're at the end of it. But several months ago, there was a fascinating article in the New York Times showing women surrounded by just aisles and aisles of shoes. And the article actually, based on a survey, of course, but in New York City, that women were not running out buying new coats, new outfits, any new clothes, but they were buying new shoes because it was, they felt as if they could spruce themselves up just with it always lifts your spirits if you're a certain kind of a woman. I'm one of them. When depressed, go shoe shopping, and makeup. So makeup obviously at a lower price point than a new coat. And so that's what women have been doing. There's another phenomenon, I think, that's going on that accounts for the continuing growth of the cosmetic market. And that is it's sort of a reversal of the cliche. And the way I put it is that 30 is the new 50, meaning that even 30-year-olds start buying the anti-wrinkle cream, the anti-aging cream, start worrying about those fine lines. Whereas probably 15 years ago, that was at 40, and 10 years ago, it was at 50. So this reminds me, it's kind of related, of a comment that my mother told me once, and since we're only 3 days from Mother's Day, so I was coming up against a big birthday, the big 5-0, and fretting about it a little bit, and my mother said, "Susan, come on, 50 is not the big one, 70 is the big one." So she put me right smack in my place. Let's cover the law, the statutory definition of cosmetic. Articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied into the human body or any part thereof for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance. Articles intended for use as a component of any such articles. And remember, I believe on the first day, I brought up the principle of intended use, which is very often one of the absolute benchmarks for an FDA decision as to what category of product does this particular item fit into. Now, one thing that might be confusing is the sprayed into or introduced into. It confused me at first. Because it almost sounds like injections, like needles, so it sounds drug-like. But in fact, that was included in order to encompass things like nasal sprays, but not for sinus treatment, but to clean the nasal passages. And I think that used to be more common than it is now, but that could be sprayed into the nostrils just for cleaning purposes, and that would still be considered a cosmetic, not a drug. By contrast, the definition of a drug, articles intended for use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and we have to add to that, or any other abnormal condition, like eczema. People might not think of it as a disease, or a particular rash, like poison ivy, but that's considered an abnormal condition. So if you have a cream for poison ivy, it's very different from an anti-aging cream. Prevention of disease in man or other animals, articles other than food, and that means to separate out dietary supplements, intended to affect the structure or any function of the body of man or other animals, articles intended to use as a component of any of the articles listed above. So if a product is intended to treat, cure, mitigate, diagnose a disease or any other abnormal condition, as determined by its label, or to alter the structure or function of the body, again, as determined by its label. But here I have to mention, and I wish I had included another slide, the definition of labeling in the FDA is absolutely huge. I would say it's overbroad. But labeling includes any piece of paper, any idea, even any utterance connected with a product or the sale of a product. So my favorite example is, and this would include a promotional website. That's considered labeling, part of the labeling of a product. And there was, about 8 years ago, a container label, a bottle of Ocean Spray cranberry juice. Became a very famous warning letter. You know how in different facets of the law you point to, oh, well, the famous case of da-da-da-da. In FDA law, you say, oh, remember that Ocean Spray warning letter. Pay attention to that. At the bottom of the label, it was one of the first companies to say, visit us at www.oceanspray.com. And you went to the website, and lo and behold, it wasn't just talking about how delicious the juice was, but that how there was some evidence that cranberries could actually prevent certain diseases, including cancer. Well, that was not an approved FDA health claim. We'll have to put that to one side, but just take my word for it. And so the FDA sent the company a letter saying, well, because you're linking your website via this label comment, this reference, your entire website content becomes labeling, and therefore in your labeling you have made an unapproved health claim. Therefore, your cranberry juice becomes an unapproved new drug, similar to when I held up my water bottle and said, you know, if this says cancer cure on it, it's a drug. So very interesting things happen, but it's important to stay with this definition and keep returning to the definition. I'll give you another example for a cosmetic that was deemed by the FDA to be a drug, not for disease use or intended disease treatment, but you've all probably seen these thigh creams where apparently, you know, miracles of advertising and modern science, you rub cream on your thighs for 2 weeks and all of a sudden all your cellulite is gone and your thighs are instantly slimmer. I'm talking to the women in the audience now only. But you've all seen them. Those types of products are considered drugs by the FDA. Why? Whether they contain any drug ingredient, any active ingredient at all. They could contain just cucumber extract. The FDA doesn't care. But it is claiming to alter the structure of the body, namely the size of your thighs or your tummy, and that makes it a drug. Then to make it even more confusing, I mean, so far I think that distinction was pretty clear, but there is a hybrid category called cosmetic drugs that includes sunscreens, which of course moisturize the skin and are soothing after you've been out in the sun, but also do prevent skin cancer, so that fits the drug definition. Sunscreens are actually regulated as OTC drugs within their own special monograph. There's a monograph on sunscreens, and right now the FDA is trying to decide what to do about the TiO2, which we keep mentioning. There's going to be an entire paper, the last paper of this conference is going to be just on sunscreens. So I'm going to leave that for that presentation. Another example would be dandruff shampoo, which of course cleans your hair, makes it shiny and bright, but also cures dandruff, and which is an abnormal condition. So that would be another example of a cosmetic drug. Those types of products are governed as OTC drug monographs, so they need a drug facts label on the back, much more carefully labeled and scrutinized and regulated than are cosmetics. In fact, if you flip around your toothpaste tube, on the back of the tube, you will now see, as of several years ago, a drug facts box, which sounds a little strange, unless it's, you know, Tom's of Maine natural toothpaste without any active ingredient. But most toothpaste, you flip it around, and the first thing you're going to see is active ingredient, and that's because it is considered an over-the-counter drug. I've tried to list every single FDA category from the least regulated to the most regulated, and shame on me, at first I forgot pet supplements, but they're in there now too. I put cosmetics at the very top as the least regulated, in part because that's true in legal terms, in part it's true in terms of FDA priorities. About 3 years ago I had a similar list, and instead I put pet foods and pet supplements at the very top as the least regulated. But then with all of the contaminated pet foods and ingredients that came in from China, for a while it was a very top FDA priority So cosmetics became my least regulated. But basically, if you look at this list, the whole first top half of the list does not require FDA pre-approval, except for the few exceptions I've given. Food additives for foods, color additives for cosmetics do require pre-market approval, or at least notification. And then you see toward the middle, over-the-counter drugs, again, regulated by OTC drug monographs, which essentially set permitted active ingredients pre-market so that you're allowed to use only those already pre-approved active ingredients. So there's a certain constraint there. And then, of course, at the end, prescription drugs and biologics, which are the most heavily regulated. Let's just look at a few examples of nanoparticles used in cosmetics. There are many, many more, and many that we don't even know about. But there are certain what are called bioactive ingredients, meaning they might be derived from plants, they might be nutrients that are typically used in dietary supplements, but they are also used in cosmetics, and they are engineered to be in very, very tiny sizes. And the purpose of this, we'll get to the next slide, but typically so that they can be absorbed more easily and have greater effects on the skin and even underneath the skin, and that's where we run into problems, as we said. Nanoparticles are also used as what are called functional stabilizers. Some proteins and some carbohydrates are very suitable as nanostabilizers, again, for these bioactive components of cosmetics. Also, enzymes can be used to add novel functionalities to polymers. And enzymes, as you probably know, are contained in our body. There are things called digestive enzymes, which serve as catalysts for digestion. So similar thing within a cosmetic, the enzymes would further break down other components of the cream so that you could again, have better absorption and use of that particular cream. A fourth example is one I mentioned, I think, the first day, which is there is now a nano gold cream selling for a mere $420 an ounce, which is intended to eradicate deep wrinkles. There's one expression I really liked for as we get older, these lines that run from the nose to the mouth, and someone called them the parenthesis of your smile. And a lot of women of a certain age want to get rid of that parenthesis once and for all, or at least week by week. In terms of the benefits, why use nanoparticles in cosmetics? As we said, it does give you the improved absorption. Typically, it's used for transdermal penetration. Some people call it dermal penetration, so that it does get beyond the skin level. But that could be good news and bad news, depending on what the science actually shows. And special nanotech serums that can actually change the structure of the skin. In other words, changing the, now we're back to the drug definition, altering the structure or function of the body, in this case, the structure of your face. And you've all seen, probably since the 60s, they've been on the market, and we're going to look at a few of them, creams that are called facelift in a bottle, where they claim to be an alternative to going out there and having an actual facelift. So, but the idea of these newer nanotech creams is that they truly will, at the cellular level, get rid of the deep lines, not just the appearance of fine lines, because any old cosmetic cream can do that, but to actually change the deeper lines and the structure of the face so that you have plumper cells and lose that that saggy look, and it just gives you that instant lift. Of course, we've talked about nanotech sunscreens as cosmetic drugs, and was mentioned the first day. Very often the benefit of that is for appearance only, and that is not the white pasty look, and instead a transparent or translucent appearance of the sunscreen. More on that later this morning. Now, what about the number of nanotech cosmetics on the market? How big of a problem is this? And the answer is nobody knows. There is very good evidence from the companies themselves that L'Oreal and Estee Lauder were working on nanotech cosmetics at least as of 15 years ago. But of course, these are very high-level, sophisticated companies. They've done all of the safety tests, the same level of testing that they do for any other chemical or ingredient that they would use. But they do not tend to advertise the fact, either in labeling websites, that they are using these nanoparticles. The Woodrow Wilson Center, we've mentioned the Penn project in March of '06, at the very beginning of inventorying what consumer products contain nano. Found that there were 58 nano personal care products. By February of '08, Penn upped the number to 85. I ran my own search in late March of this year, just trying to see how many patents contain the word nano and cosmetic in the text, and the hit number was 562. But then recently, John Bailey, who was the former director of the Office of Cosmetics and Color Additives at the FDA, is now running a consulting company, said that there could be as many as 1,000. Possible risks of nanocosmetics are going to be similar to the possible risks of sunscreens. We heard a little bit about that yesterday. We'll hear more later on this morning. But again, the science is not precisely known, but there's some evidence that nanotech topical products do penetrate the skin. Do they get to the bloodstream? If so, do the particles migrate to the brain? There are articles on both sides of that debate. Most scientists agree that nanotech topical products should not be used on damaged skin or on wounds. There's some evidence that nanoparticles may damage bacterial cell walls. And then, of course, there's the added, when we're looking at the environment, when we're looking holistically, we have the problem that there are bacterial soaps, or both bacterial soaps and other nanotech products containing nanosilver creams can be washed down the drain into our waterways, and then what happens to the clams and the sea anemones and the other aquatic life? It's another possible issue. As we mentioned yesterday, many groups and individuals, but especially the Woodrow Wilson Center, again, points to the fact that in terms of the federal budget for nanotech research, what is allocated for risk research is typically around 3% or 5%, whereas they argue it should be up to 10%. I see that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. FDA's current position on nanotech products. FDA held public stakeholder meetings, as I mentioned, yesterday, I think, in 2005 and 2006. And decided to issue its task force, and a task force was formed, of course. It was given 9 months to come up with a report, because some argued that FDA in 2006 was already 10 years behind, said one feisty lawyer at the meeting. But FDA did, I think, a very nice job with its task force report. It's very readable. It's about maybe 30 pages long, and it stresses the point that FDA does not regulate technologies, it regulates finished products, so it looks at the category of product it's dealing with. Over and over again in that task force report, the FDA repeats, we don't think we have a problem with drugs and medical devices because they go through complete pre-market approval in any case for any new product, whether it's nanotech or not. So if there's a safety issue, we're going to catch it. Our real problem, our real headache is with dietary supplements and cosmetics because they don't go through the pre-approval process, and we're trying to decide what to do about that. The added problem of the FDA is that until very recently, of course, it was underfunded, it was understaffed, and there were many more FDA priorities, including continuing problems in the U.S. With E. coli in hamburger, salmonella in eggs, inability to trace foods back to the source. And now we have pending in Congress the food safety bill. I just mentioned this as a framework that we all need to consider. Why isn't FDA doing more about nanotech sunscreens and cosmetics? Well, it has other problems on its plate, including possible bioterrorism, contamination of the water system, but just recurring problems with the food supply. And presumably those types of problems will be resolved once the food safety bill is in place and the tracking system, which is mandated, is also working. But I had better get to some solutions. So I'm going to page through close to the end with a short note by saying that even some non-nanotech cosmetics will be viewed by the FDA as drugs because they're going to claim to alter the effect of the body. Since I was supposed to talk about labeling, and since my time is up, and I'll certainly talk more when we have our presentation, let me say that one possible solution is for the FDA to issue a guidance document. It might not be ready to promulgate a proposed rule on the regulation of all nanotech products, but it would be very helpful for both dietary supplements and for cosmetics to issue a guidance document, which can be done more quickly with input from stakeholders. And what the FDA did suggest at the end of the task force report and could make a very strong recommendation within this future guidance document is that if you have a new nanotech cosmetic, your first step would be a transparent meeting with the FDA, sit down with FDA, with the Office of Cosmetics, show us your safety data, and we'll give you our very best advice. Another possibility, if the FDA wanted to, was they could, via regulation, the rulemaking process of notice in the Federal Register, notice and comment period, they could strengthen the cosmetic labeling regulations to require that the amounts of each of the ingredients be listed, and they could, if they wanted to, amend the labeling regulations for cosmetics to require that the size of particle be listed if it were a nanotech product. And that could be done without pre-market review, so at least you'd have some data to look back on. Final thought, the FDA could require what is called pre-market notice, not quite the level of pre-market approval or review, which would be analogous to what is required for dietary supplements. For new dietary ingredients, it's called an NDI notification. If you have a new dietary ingredient, meaning not grandfathered in by the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of October '94, if it was not on the market before then, it's new, like lycopene instead of tomato paste, powdered tomato paste, lycopene was a new ingredient. You submit your safety evidence to the FDA 75 days pre-market and then get a green light from the agency. So that's another possible solution if the FDA wanted to enact some sort of mid-level oversight, additional oversight over nanotech cosmetics. More later. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so I am in lab. I've just made this fantastic new red dye. It's fluorescent. I think it would make really cool eyeshadow. So is there anything that would prevent me from just marketing that? I mean,
yes, because if it's a new red dye, it's a new color additive.
Okay.
And that does need pre-market
What if it's
approval.
not a red dye? What if it does something else? I mean, it supports the structure of the eyelids or something. Or
That's an interesting question
Gives you
because
alluring
you have this
eyelashes
new
or-
phenomenon now of women getting where they would put eyeliner. Women getting tattoos, right?
Yeah.
To my knowledge, tattoos, for example, are regulated by, at state licensing agencies. But that is a scary thing. I mean, that's not nanotech, but it's another thing the FDA should be looking at.
I guess what this question is really asking is there must be a framework for deciding that you can't market eyeshadow that's made of thallium. Okay, with something that's got known hazards. But
yes,
what do you do about new?
And in 2 words, there's a great deterrent for that. It's called product liability.
Yeah,
You're going to get a product liability suit. I mean, same thing with that I argue to my dietary supplement clients. You do not want to put some unknown new berry in your new dietary supplement and not go through the NDI notification process because you're afraid you're going to be shut down, because you want to at least run your own safety studies to make sure that this isn't going to cause some serious adverse event.
Okay, but I guess what it sounds like is that for an ingredient of unknown toxicity, the impetus is all on the person who wants to make the product. They can produce the product. And then if it harms people, if people are going blind, then there's a consequence?
That's the problem for cosmetics and for dietary supplements and for foods, whether it's a new nano ingredient or just a new ingredient.
Okay.
With the exception of the NDI notification for new dietary ingredients that I mentioned, a new cosmetic ingredient, the manufacturer has the burden to run its own safety tests.
Okay, because it doesn't seem that
and
there's
the FDA has no guidance on that, and maybe we need another guidance document on what level of safety testing
It doesn't seem that there's
required.
anything unique about nanochemicals or nanomaterials in that kind of a framework.
Right. You're right about that. There is very little guidance from the FDA itself as to what kind of safety testing is required for any new cosmetic.
Okay, we can take one more question.
All right. In many cosmetics or in paints or anything that has a color iridescence type property, there are pigments, and many of the pigments are made out of metals. And the question is, when the metals have very little health data associated with them, whether it's in animals or humans, where is the threshold for introducing the metals into cosmetics?
Well, the same answer. The FDA has given no threshold. That kind of leads to another point that I didn't get to, so I'm going to use your question to make that other point, and that is consumer acceptance. And there aren't very many studies, but the studies that have been done, and there was one out of Zurich, shows that that consumers, again, it's irrational, as we were discussing yesterday, that consumers are much more accepting of nanotech food packaging, which is another huge growing market, which maybe if you have this conference a year or two from now again, somebody will be up here talking about nano food packaging. So consumers very accepting of that, despite the fact that there is known dispersion of nanoparticles into the food. And in this survey, the consumers were given various different hypothetical products. What about a nanotech healthy tea versus a nanotech cancer drug? Clearly, they were much more willing to accept the nanotech cancer drug over the nanotech version of the healthy tea. Why? Because if it's going to give you therapeutic value, then you're willing to take whatever risk there is in a nanotech product. So consumers are doing risk-benefit analysis. To go back to your question, if it were known, if it were on the label, and again, there are absolutely zero labeling requirements for nanotech under current FDA regulations. And so that would be a good question for our FDA official. But if this new pigment were not, now are you saying not nano, just a pigment?
Yeah, like any metal, like I'm starting to see.
Oh yeah.
Any metal on the periodic table is big. They're starting.
Right, for very sparkly eyeshadow, and apparently fish scales are being used for the sparkly lipstick. Yeah, and it is not monitored. That's the answer.
Thanks for the answer, and we look forward to more when we get to the rest of the panel discussion. But now, Mr. Pena.